Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to an episode of All Things Policy brought by the Takshashila Institution. Today we have with us guest Dr. Pradeep Taneja, a senior lecturer from the University of Melbourne, also Deputy Associate Dean of the International section of University of Melbourne, and I'm very excited to have him with us today.
Thank you, Vanshika. Good to be with you.
And I'm Vanshika, a research analyst from the Indo-Pacific Studies program. And today we'll be discussing the Quad agenda and India-Australia ties within the Quad. So thank you, Pradeep, so much. So let's start with what happened this weekend, which was the Quad Leaders Summit. What do you think were the most important takeaways from the summit?
Okay, at the end of the summit, they issued, as usual, a long joint statement, and the statements are getting longer and longer. And this time it was more than 5,000 words. So obviously it's almost the length of a journal article. So it makes for a tedious reading. But if you analyze it and you compare it with the last joint statement from the Hiroshima Quad Summit, I think May 2023, the language is much more strident, particularly in tackling the China challenge.
Right.
Although it also doesn't mention China, Quad statements never mention China directly, but it's clear that the language that was being used, particularly about South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, aggression, coercive tactics being used by other powers, clearly the reference was to China. So when we compare this year's 2024 joint statement from the Quad Summit with the last few, it is very clear that there is much more assertive, much stronger pushback, I think, against China. And although the statement doesn't mention China, we know that there was a hot mic moment where President Biden thought that he wasn't on air, but it
Right.
was recorded, and he directly refers to China and talks about China's coercive tactics in South China Sea, etc. So clearly, when we look at the deliberations in Delaware and the joint statement, it is clear that there is a much stronger pushback against China's heavy-handed tactics in the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, and in the East China Sea. But apart from that, apart from the fact that the language used is much stronger, um, it is also clear from this Quad summit that the leaders have made sure that there should be no doubt that Quad is here to stay. In fact, the last line of the statement says Quad is here to stay. And Prime Minister Modi also said in his remarks that Quad is here to stay. Now, it's important that they make that statement because there are four leaders in the Quad, and two of them will not be there for the next summit. President Biden, of course, finishes his term at the end of this year, and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan is leaving office very soon. So, and Prime Minister Albanese of Australia faces an election before the next summit. So, judging by the current sort of license to govern, license to be in power, only Prime Minister Modi is the one who is still likely to be there at the next Quad summit. And he's also going to host the next summit. So it was important that the leaders made it clear that regardless of whether they are going to be at the next summit or not, Quad is here to stay. That, of course, doesn't guarantee that President Biden's successor, whether it is former President Trump or Kamala Harris, that they would make the same commitment to Quad. I think Kamala Harris is likely to continue President Biden's foreign policy, and therefore Quad is likely to continue the way it has been, because President Biden really elevated it from the ministerial level to the leaders level. And I think Kamala Harris is likely to continue, although I can't be certain about President Trump that if he's reelected, whether he would do the same.
Right. Thank you, Professor Taneja. So you're right. We have two leaders departing. So there is a long term question of the Quad's continuity. And I think India being at the helm next year is a good vision for the Quad going forward. So, as you mentioned, this time the summit did not shy away from mentioning, not directly mentioning China, but indirectly, and always being in the shadow, the China issue. But we also see that the Quad is moving beyond security issues and it's expanding to global governance issues. So, how do you see India and Australia positioning themselves in this more expansive framework of the Quad?
Yeah. You'll remember that when Quad started, it was referred to as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. The four member countries have deliberately tried to move away from
Right.
that particular language. They refer to it as Quad, but the language of Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is how it began, is disappearing slowly. And Quad's agenda keeps widening. At every summit, every foreign ministers meeting, new things are being added to the Quad's agenda. So, for example, in the Delaware summit, they again have expanded the agenda. There, for example, there's an agreement that there's going to be this cervical cancer vaccine, the so-called Quad Cancer Moonshot, and that's going to make these vaccines available to a lot of small states in the region. So beyond the four Quad members, for example, many of the Pacific Island countries where a lot of women die because of this cancer, cervical cancer, Australia has committed, I think the government has committed nearly $15 million, and a non governmental organization, an NGO run by an Australian billionaire businessman, has committed another $13 million to this cause. So, from Australia's point of view, Australia is going to help in distributing and delivering these cervical cancer vaccines to women all over the Pacific. So many women will benefit. When you compare, for example, the incidence of cervical cancer and the number of deaths, in when you compare Pacific Islands, small states, with Australia, 13 times more women die in the Pacific Islands of this cancer. So that's a good thing that Quad will deliver, vaccines as it had done earlier with COVID. The Quad
Right.
Quad leaders, worked together to deliver, COVID vaccines. India made vaccines were delivered with the help of the three other Quad members, and the distribution label was very interesting because Australia offered to provide the logistics. India provided the vaccine, US, Japan provided the money, and it allowed them to actually essentially play to their advantage in distributing COVID vaccines. So the agenda is widening. So at this the Delaware summit, we've seen, for example, this Quad Cancer Moonshot initiative added. We've seen more focus on joint Coast Guard operation. Now, Coast Guard operation is part of security because Coast Guard operations that China has been carrying out in the South China Sea and even Taiwan Strait are quite assertive. China's Coast Guard behaves more like a navy, and in fact, they have much bigger Coast Guard ships than any other Coast Guard in the region. So the Coast Guard initiative, which has been added at this summit, at the Delaware summit, is clearly related to security, but many other initiatives have gone way beyond what we would consider security in traditional terms.
Right.
They may be part of non traditional security, and not everything is part of non traditional security, but certainly I think we can consider the vaccines initiative, whether it is the COVID vaccines and now the cervical cancer vaccine, they are certainly part of the non traditional security.
Right. I think the Quad benefits from focusing on an issue like health. because as we saw during the pandemic, international collaboration during times of crisis becomes absolutely crucial. And given that Quad is continuing that agenda, I think in terms of emergency, the Quad will be able to assimilate, especially during the outbreak of a pandemic. You also mentioned Pacific Island nations. So, on that, we've seen in the last few years, especially after China making inroads in the region, that all other countries have also started showing their interest. The US has released a Pacific Pledge. Australia and New Zealand have, come up with a step up and reset initiatives. So, do you think, given that Quad also focuses on climate change and humanitarian issues, disaster relief, engagement with the Pacific Islands should be a plank within the Quad?
I think in a way it already is. As we said, with this, the cancer, cervical cancer vaccine, Australia has made a significant commitment. And remember, from Australia's point of view, the Pacific, the South Pacific is Australia's neighborhood. Some Australian politicians tend to refer to it as our backyard. And they feel that it is Australia's responsibility to make sure that it delivers public goods in the region and helps out countries, smaller countries who themselves do not have state capacity
Right.
to provide those public goods. So from Australia's point of view, it's important. But it's also interesting that Australia has been asking other Quad partners to play a bigger role in its own backyard. Japan, of course, has been a player in the South Pacific for a long time because Japan has been along with Australia, it's been a key provider of foreign aid to Pacific Island states for a long time. So Japan has been doing that in terms of building infrastructure, providing assistance in many other ways. But the fact that India is also now welcomed by Australia, because historically, Australia would have seen India's involvement in the South Pacific as a bit of a concern,
Right.
as an outside power. But now, as India is part of the Quad and India is part of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, Australia now doesn't worry about India's involvement. In fact, it encourages India to participate in providing assistance and being involved in the Pacific Islands. So that's a positive development. And we saw, for example, last year when Prime Minister Modi visited Australia, he also went to Papua New Guinea for the first time. It's I can't remember. I don't think any other prime minister has been to Papua New Guinea before. So Prime Minister Modi went to Papua New Guinea. He was very warmly received by the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, and that is a beginning in a way. Although India has been periodically holding those, the forums for the Pacific Islands, but I think in the future we are likely to see greater involvement by India in the Pacific Islands.
Right. Given that you mentioned Indo-Pacific and South Pacific, I think you know what I'm going to ask. What role has geography played in Australia's vision of the Quad and shaping its policy?
I think what we are seeing with Quad, a division of labor in the sense that countries, whether it's Australia or Japan or India, their resources are finite. The amount of resources they can devote to external, programs in helping other countries around the region, their resource distribution largely depends on their interest, how far their interests stretch. So while India is willing to be involved and offer assistance to Pacific Island states, but Pacific Island states are unlikely to be a major focus of India's assistance. India's focus will remain on the Indian Ocean. It will remain on South Asia. It will remain on India's immediate neighborhood. Australia, on the other hand, would focus much more on the Pacific. So there is a kind of a distribution which is determined by geography. So geography plays a very important part. We've seen, for example, even with the Indo-Pacific, the patrolling, maritime domain awareness, which again Quad has agreed to collaborate in maritime domain awareness. But when it comes to patrolling the seas, India is more likely to look after northern and western Indian Ocean. Australia, on the other hand, says that the Eastern Indian Ocean is Australia's priority. Indian officials have told me, in my conversation, that they would like Australia to play a greater role in the Western Indian Ocean. But Australia too has limited capacity. So Australia is unlikely, I think, in the short term. Australia is acquiring a nuclear submarine as part of AUKUS. When Australia has that capability, I think Australia would play a greater role, even as far as the Western Indian Ocean. But I think the way the member states of the Quad, with the exception of the United States, because United States is a global power. It has a global presence, and therefore US can be seen in different parts of the world. But even the US has been asking Australia to do the heavy lifting in the Pacific. For example, you saw Australia recently announced a $400 million package in the Pacific. And the US said, look, we're relying on you essentially to look after the region. So there is a division of labor. India would be expected by other Quad countries to help out much more in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean, whereas Japan has a bigger role in the Pacific and in the East Asian region, and of course Australia in the South Pacific.
Right. So, dialing back from the international to the domestic, I think we're really curious to know, how does the Australian public perceive Quad? And do you think there is a difference in how India and Australia frame their participation in the group?
I think so. I think there is a slight difference in the way Australia and India approach their participation in the Quad or the motivation for being part of the Quad. In Australia's case, China has been Australia's largest trading partner for a very long time. Australia is one of the very few countries that has a big trade surplus in its trade with China. In other words, Australia exports more than it imports from China, even though everything in Australia seems to be imported from China. But still, because Australia is a major exporter of commodities, iron ore, coal, gas, and all kinds of other raw materials. So China and Australia have a relationship where there is, a great amount of economic interdependence. And Australia looks at China as both as a partner but as a challenge in security terms, particularly with China's actions in the South China Sea. In fact, just in the last few days, there was a documentary shown on Chinese television about the PLA, because PLA recently marked its on the 1st of August, its anniversary, its founding. And PLA showed this documentary on China Central Television showed an incident from 2 years ago where a Chinese Air Force aircraft intercepted an Australian surveillance plane in international waters. And it did so very aggressively. And at the time, Australia complained, and Australia said this was a very dangerous thing to do. China said no, it was the Australian, pilot who was behaving in a dangerous way. But the video, which is now being shown on Chinese television, and the interview with the Chinese pilot in that documentary clearly shows that Chinese pilot deliberately acted in a very aggressive fashion. So, because of that, Australia does have security concerns, and the broader, posture of China in the Indo-Pacific region is a matter of concern. In India's case, India has always seen China as a challenge, going back to the 1962 war and more recently in the border clashes that we've seen in eastern Ladakh. So for India, China is a challenge. But unlike other Quad partners, India has a bigger problem with China. Nobody has a land border. None of the three other partners in the Quad have a long land border with China. India has nearly 3,500 kilometer long land border with China. And therefore, India always have to be alert about the potential of a minor incident in the Pacific or in the South China Sea becoming a bigger problem along the border in the Himalayas. So for India, the land border with China is a big challenge. It's a disputed border because there's no consensus even on where the line of actual control even lies. So India has to deal with China in the Indian Ocean. India has to be aware, alert to China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, but it also has to make sure that it is prepared to deal with any challenge on its border with China, on the land border with China.
Right. It's interesting you just mentioned that incident with the PLA. And also last month, it was the first time that a Chinese military aircraft violated Japanese national airspace, not just the air defense identification zone. So we're seeing China is increasing sort of posturing using these tactics. And there's been enough discussion on how a Quad is never going to be an alliance. There's not actually going to be a Squad either with the Philippines or South Korea. So the question of Quad expanding for the moment, at least in terms of entry of new members, has been a conversation that none of the four members have encouraged. So do you think that this approach to the Quad for the time being is sustainable?
Well, next year would be interesting. Next year, India would be hosting the Quad leaders meeting. Last year, when India was the chair and India hosted the G20, India brought the African Union into the G20. India lobbied. India, as as the chair, India obviously had the advantage that India essentially
Mm.
defines the agenda. And for next year's Quad summit, India would be in a position to define the agenda of Quad. And I am still waiting to see whether the Indian government proposes a further expansion, perhaps in some way lending greater voice to the global south through the Quad. I mean, I'm not privy to any government policy, so I can't say what government might be thinking. And I think maybe the government leaders at the moment don't know. But as they set their mind to defining the agenda for 2025 Quad Summit, I expect that there would be some initiative, maybe not necessarily expansion of the
Right.
Quad, but perhaps in terms of priorities for the 2025 Quad Summit, there could be a greater focus on the global south because India is increasingly positioning itself as the leader of the global south. And in that, it shares that same aspiration for China because China also sees itself as the leader of the global south. China does have deeper pockets than India. Its economy is nearly 5 times the size of India's economy. So, judging by the G20 presidency, I think Prime Minister Modi might be tempted to pursue that agenda, the global south agenda, through the Quad also. So expect, I think, some innovation when it comes to the inclusion of global south or perhaps a greater voice for the global south through the Quad. It may not be an expansion, but certainly there could be policies or agenda items that may focus on the priorities or the needs of the global south.
That is some much needed optimism. I'm glad you brought that up. So, coming back to a bit of the non traditional issues, we've seen in the recent years that one of Quad's priorities has been education. So, it's rolled out STEM fellowships. This year, it has expanded its fellowships to the ASEAN region. So, given your experience as a professor in Australia, how do you see academic collaboration, research exchanges? How do you see education contributing to the Quad agenda?
I mean, education has already been, or at least academic exchanges, scholarly exchanges, have already been made part of the Quad. So, for example, there are Quad fellowships, particularly focusing on technology, critical technologies that all the Quad countries feel that they are important to their own security and their own needs. But I think gradually, given that the Quad agenda has been expanding, widening, it is very likely that we will see greater academic collaboration. I think if Quad is to become a sustainable sort of platform, then it would be important that academics and students, particularly tertiary students, higher education students, are included in the dialogue. And there is education about the Quad. For example, at the moment, apart from some very alert, smart students, a majority of the students studying political science in universities in India do not really read a lot about the Quad. So I think we are going to see greater focus on not only exchanges and scholarship, but also in terms of curriculum, a greater awareness of the Indo-Pacific idea and, of course, Quad. So, and it would be good because it would mean that more people would be aware and the need for Quad could be explained better to the young people and to the people in general. And education, I think, and academic exchanges can play a big part in that.
Right, right. Coming to the partnership between India and Australia, what areas of collaboration do you see holding the most potential for both nations?
We just discussed education, and education is one of the most important areas of joint activity between Australia and India, particularly Indian students coming to Australia to study. The number of Indian students in some of the universities has been rising, fairly rapidly. For a couple of universities in Australia, Indian students are their most important source of international student market. Many other universities also have a large number of Indian students, even vocational colleges. In Australia, we have something called TAFE colleges, which are essentially vocational education or technical education institutes. Even there, you see a growing number of Indian students. And some of the Australian vocational colleges are also partnering with ITIs and other technical schools in India to improve their offerings. A couple of Australian universities are also setting up, in fact, they've already announced setting up campuses in India. My own university, University of Melbourne, has recently opened a global center in Delhi. So education is a very important part of that bilateral relationship. Education also plays a part in people to people relationship
Yeah.
because many of the students who go to Australia stay back. They become migrants in Australia with the long term objective of staying and working in Australia. So student movements or student mobility has contributed to a larger share of the migration intake in Australia from India. So people to people ties have also been strengthened as a result of educational and student exchanges. But Australia and India also signed a closer trade agreement, or I mean a preliminary trade agreement, and negotiations are now about to start, I think, on a full-fledged free trade agreement. And trade has grown since the ACTA was signed. The trade between Australia and India has continued to grow, and there is a lot of potential, particularly as Indian economy continues to grow at a fast clip. That there is a possibility that India will also become a major market for Australian minerals and commodities, as Japan has done, South Korea has done in the past, and China for the last 40 years.
Right.
So, iron ore, for example, at the moment, iron ore, India is self sufficient. India actually exports iron ore. But if India is to follow China's example, and if India is to achieve even half of China's steel production, because China is now the world's largest producer of steel, if India produces even half of the steel that China produces, India would need to import iron ore. India's domestic supply of iron ore would not be sufficient. So it's very likely that India will become a major importer of Australian commodities. So whether it's education, whether it is people to people ties, whether it's agriculture sort of imports, and obviously defense is one area, defense and security, where cooperation is growing. So Australia India relationship has become multidimensional. It has some challenges, but overall the relationship between Australia and India has never been stronger.
Right. In terms of quad working groups, there are working groups on critical and emerging tech, on telecommunication, cybersecurity, space. Do you see India and Australia coming together on these fronts?
And they already are. There is already cooperation, whether it is critical minerals, cybersecurity, areas in which there are complementarities.
Right.
So, for example, if you look at cybersecurity, India has the human resources, India has the manpower. Australia may have some advantage in technology, some of the technologies, but Australia has the manpower. So, when it comes to cybersecurity, India has a lot to contribute to not only the Quad, but also the bilateral relationship. In terms of critical minerals, Australia produces many of those critical minerals. India will be the consumer of those critical minerals. And India also has the capacity for refining for some of the minerals, processing them, and of course for end use. So there is a complementarity. It's possible that some of these critical minerals could be mined in Australia, processed in India, and then re-exported to Australia for Australian use. But they're probably likely to be used more in India than in Australia, because India already has a bigger manufacturing base than Australia, and India's manufacturing base is set to grow. So I think in critical minerals, we are going to see a lot of cooperation. Australia is stronger in terms of research in this area, particularly in terms of mining industry. So Australia would capitalize on its own competitive advantage, but there are complementarities in this area.
Right. Thank you so much, Pradeep. I was going to end perhaps on China, but I think we've discussed China enough, and we should not bring the narrative back and make Quad only about China.
Indeed.
Right. So thank you, Pradeep, for being on All Things Policy and for today's session.
Thank you, Vanshika. It's good to be here.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.